Welcome back to the Munn Avenue Muse podcast, brought to you by MunnAvenuePress.com. We are a publisher of books and fiction and nonfiction from authors around the world. We also help turn books into bestsellers. And today I'm very excited and delighted to have one of our best-selling authors, Dr. Demetria McNeal, who is a communication scientist, PhD communication scientist, academic researcher, popular speaker, corporate trainer, and communications coach. She helps individuals, executives, entrepreneurs, healthcare institutions, and healthcare clinicians dismantle communication pitfalls that stifle relationships, create disparities in health outcomes, derail health interventions, and impede organizational progress. Demetria is renowned for her fun, highly interactive, and engaging presentations and her ability to help consulting clients own their communication. She's a keynote speaker, wife, bonus mom, and writer at DemetriaMcNealAuthor.com. And I'll probably have to ask about what bonus mom means. So welcome, Demetria.
Thank you for having me, Charlie.
Oh, I'm just so delighted to see you again. And you do have one of the best smiles ever. So you always
Thank you.
brightens up my day to see you.
Happy to share it with the world.
So for those of us who don't know,
Yes.
what is a communication scientist? How did you get into this? Tell us a little more about that.
So the short answer is, what is a communication scientist? I think it depends on you asking the communication scientist how they define it. Because it can take on many different hats. When I'm referring to myself as a communication scientist, as you mentioned, my terminal degree is in communication studies. So that is the crust of, if you will, my academic training. All of my education sort of stops there in terms of the training, the theories, all of that. So I have that underpinning the work that I do. So the work that I do in terms of as a communication scientist, how does that make sense in the real world? I work with individuals, organizations, and a lot of healthcare institutions from the perspective of understanding how communication doesn't happen. Oftentimes we think communication is happening, and it just isn't. And so that stifles a lot of progress, and it hampers relationships in the workplace as well as in personal relationships. But that's what I do in terms of being, quote, a communication scientist, is being able to understand what works well, what doesn't work well in terms of the communication process. So there are a lot of different ways you can do that. You can do analyses, you can do systemic evaluations, you can do needs assessments. There are just a lot of things you can do to really understand what is or is not happening from a communication perspective. And I think oftentimes people are surprised that the issues that they're having can be traced back to a breakdown in communication.
Well, it might be helpful if you could give us an example. I know in your book, and we're going to talk more about your book, you talk about taboos in communication. So
That's
can
right.
you give us a specific example of what people don't say? Coincidentally, the name of the book is You Don't Say.
Yes,
What people
sir.
don't say
Yes, sir.
and how they can turn that around.
Absolutely. So You're absolutely right with that. I mentioned kind of taboo topics and things that have been stigmatized, if you will, by culture. And those are things that people just do not want to talk about. And
Like what? Like what?
yeah, I was going to give a couple examples
Sure.
because what happens with taboo topics and things that are stigmatized, there's a cultural sort of association with it, but then there's also a personal internal association with it, as well as potentially a familial association with it, right? So there are some families that if there is a family member that has is living with an addiction, for example, or a mental illness, they may not talk about it in that respective family. But there are other families that absolutely talk about it, right? And so that then creates a space for an individual to either not talk about it or do talk about it. And that also impacts how they interact with the world, right? So things that you now have deemed are issues that you do not say, you do not repeat, that follows you at work, at the grocery store. It follows you in life. That becomes a part of you. And so when you say, gosh, how do you get people to now talk about that? I think people have to realize what the impact is having for them not having those conversations or not acknowledging that me not talking about this is causing a problem. Right. So me now having to keep a secret that isn't even mine. Oftentimes we're harboring secrets. They're not our secrets. They're other people's secrets that they've imparted on us. Right. And you may say, guess what? I don't want to be your secret holder. How about that? I don't want to hold your secrets. And so, but you grow up into that. So and especially if you're a child, you don't have the space or the language or the capacity to, right, have that kind of conversation, especially if it's an adult, to say, well, I don't want to keep your secret. All right. 5-year-olds aren't saying that. And so I think that as you grow up and mature and you have been raised and acculturated, and society has sort of influenced your beliefs, you grow up and you reach a point in your life where you now have all of these issues that you just haven't talked about, and they manifest in different ways, at work, in relationships, in marriages, in friendships. They manifest. And so
And physical ailments too.
oh, great goodness. So the research that I do that we don't have to talk about in great deal with healthcare, and particularly I focus on cardiovascular disease. But when we talk about just the impact and the influence of stress alone on the body and what it does, there's that in and of itself causes problem and ultimately death. And when I say death, that's because it can cause hypertension, stroke, heart failure, all of these other things that can then lead to death, which is why I say death is sort of on the other side of that worst case scenario. But it's not exclusive to cardiovascular disease. When we talk about chronic diseases in general, a lot of it goes back to sort of lifestyle management. And oftentimes we think of lifestyle management as just physical activity. But I will tell you, being able to say something that you never said before can be healing.
Well, that's profound. Um, can be healing and relieve some of that stress, as well as
Absolutely.
improve the relationship, right, with whoever that might be. Yeah. So,
Absolutely.
um, yeah. So you're, and I want to talk a little more about that because I had a personal revelation about it. This is so profound, and
Okay.
but they don't teach this in school, right? I mean, why don't they teach this in
So,
school?
so if it was my way, it absolutely would be taught in school, and I'm talking in every grade, K through 12, and at the collegiate level, and it would be an ongoing master class in corporations because it's not taught. And so what ends up happening is all of our communication styles, the way we say things, the way we interpret things, our definitions of things, they come usually from our family of origin, our friend group, society, culture. That's where you get that from. And it really becomes a game of just trial and error and habit as well. And
Habit,
so,
yes.
and so
Habit's a big one. Yeah.
yeah, yeah,
Yeah, and trauma in
that's right.
families can cause,
Absolutely.
some people to clam up and other people to overreact. And yeah, yeah, for sure. Well, I had the question, but I think you're half answering it. Is this why you wrote your book? You don't say how we get communication wrong and how to get it right. Is that what inspired you to write the book?
It Yes, so that was part of the inspiration. The other inspiration are the friendships that I have. The average length of friendship that I have with what I call my really close circle is close to 30 years. And I say that with a caveat because these are friendships from like middle school.
Right.
So these are folks that have seen my life in a way that they can understand me now in ways that most people don't. And so whenever we have conversations, they know because they've seen me, at 12, at 15, at 18, at 22, right? And so oftentimes we're able to have that conversation that has a lot of depth and meaning. And so that is also partly what inspired me is because over the years, these close friends that I've had and these close ties that I've had, we've had conversations and we've had hard ones, and we've also gone through seasons. There are seasons where I'm closer to some, and maybe distant, in other seasons, but it's because we move in positions where we're needed, if that makes sense. And so sometimes there may be a season where I need to talk to you 3 times a day, every day, and that may go on for like 8 months. I don't know that at the time. I don't say that up front at the time. But if my life is in a situation where that is needed, and that's required, you show up, and that will happen. And then after that season, we may talk twice a year for like 3 years,
That's interesting.
or
Yeah.
see each other, right? And so
But
the ability to
you
move.
have like a baseline
Oh, absolutely.
understanding of your relationship with these
Absolutely.
friends. Because if they're willing to listen to you 3 times a day,
Well,
that's a pretty
that's
big commitment. So my longest standing friend, and this is kind of, if it isn't obvious from my gray hair, it gives
oh,
away
no
my
worries.
age, is that it was my 5-year-old playmate, it's 68
Oh,
year friendship
look at there.
that is still going.
I'm telling you.
So yeah, those long friendships are really valuable.
And you
Yeah,
get insight into the the nuance of what is and is not talked about. Because
right.
like you say, even like you have a friend, for 68 years, and I will have friendships, and a subject will come up, and I'll ask them, "Hey, how did you come to learn about X?" And I'll hear that story, and we've been friends for like 23 years, and I'm like, I did not know that. Wow, how did you, right? So you're still learning about people. Part of it is because you're curious and you're asking questions, which is always a good thing when you're trying to ensure that communication happens. Oftentimes we create narratives and we have the stories in our head, and because we thought it, we believe it to be true, and we literally function as if it's true.
So
It's not.
asking questions. This came up in another interview that we had,
Mhm.
or that past episode with Don Gabor,
Um,
who is a conversation expert.
uh-huh.
And has written books on the art of conversation, which is kind
Yes,
of
indeed.
related to yours.
It is.
And one of the big takeaways, which I'm sure is part of your what you talk about, is asking good questions and listening.
I'm
Right?
telling you. I'm telling you, Charlie. So a couple of things that's is beautiful about questions is when you're asking questions, you are signaling to another person that you're interested, right? What you're saying is important to me. When you are listening, you are equally sharing with them that they're important, what they said is important, and it has meaning and value to you. That's why the listening is also, if not more important, than the talking piece of it. And when I say talking on your end, not the question asking. Question asking is so important because it gives you information instead of you resigning to your own conclusions. Oftentimes, when things go off the rail, it is because there have been assumptions and judgments made that are based on what you think you know, what you think you saw, what somebody else told you, and that when you ask the person the question for yourself, um, you often get a better understanding.
Yeah, yeah. So, yeah, I get that. So, not to put you on the spot,
Yeah,
but I'm going to put you on the spot.
of course.
Is that let's just say you're having a difficulty communicating with your child, because I know
Yeah.
you have children. What are some questions to ask? How do you open up that line of communication if you feel it's cut off? Give me a couple of examples.
Yeah, so a couple of things that's always helpful to kind of ground what's happening if you feel that communication has been hampered or damaged in some way. It's always great to approach the person and let them know what you're thinking, and what you would like to happen. That's
So
a
what?
good
So how would you
starting place.
state it? How
Yeah,
would you say
yeah,
it?
absolutely right. I think what's always helpful when you said, gosh, if you're approaching a child, I would imagine it could, and this could be any range of age when you're thinking about child, but you could say, hey, Tommy, lately I just feel like we're off. We used to, and it could be, we used to hang out every Saturday or every day after school. We would always talk, and I kind of noticed that's not happening, and I really enjoyed those times when we did those things. So I feel like just something's off, or maybe something's going on with you. What do you think? Right? So you
Yeah,
kind
that's
of give
good.
a little and then you pause because you have to allow there to be space for them to share if they either agree, disagree, etc. Right? So there has to be space for them to kind of get in alignment with what you're, and be clear. They could very well say, you know what, I don't want to talk about this right now. So you have to be
Wait,
prepared for, if I don't want to talk about this right now, say, great, I can totally respect that this just may not be a good time for you. When do you think would be a good time?
right. The
Right.
follow-up question is a good one.
Yeah,
Yeah. And the way you phrased it was totally non-judgmental. Like
it
it
has to be.
wasn't, hey, you don't talk to me anymore.
And
Right.
that's how we lead.
Right.
Well,
Or
you
what's
bring up a
going
great
on
point.
in your life, right? Now,
You bring up a good point.
right. Yeah,
The point you're making is exactly the types of pitfalls we all fall into, of very much making it their problem. Right? So saying, well, you don't, you haven't, you've stopped.
right.
What are you
It's
doing? I
finger
think you're,
pointing.
oh, absolutely. And it's
Yeah,
blame. It's blame. So you have to immediately say, gosh, I've observed or I've noticed, and gosh, I just want, and that's why you have to go to what's the outcome is, gosh, I really want, our time back. I really enjoyed hanging out with you. So you have to give the why are you wanting to sort of initiate
right,
this conversation in
right,
terms of the
right.
angle. Yeah.
Yeah, and I just raised the example about children because I know one of the big challenges for parents is teenagers, because at that age
Absolutely.
they're separating themselves from their
That's right.
parents. They're going in their peer circles. They many of them don't want to talk to their parents.
That's right.
So you have the dinner table question. How was your day, right? And the child is frequently just doesn't want to talk about that,
Yeah. Or
right?
it's a one liner. It's like, it was okay. Right.
Right, right, right.
Right.
Do you have a remedy for getting past that, or is that just like the way it's going to be? The you're okay line. How do you get beyond that?
Well, a way to kind of get around that is the question that you ask, it may not end with that answer, right? So instead of saying, "Gosh, how was your day?" you could say, "Gosh, let's talk about at least three things you learned today when you were in school."
Be
It's
specific.
very
Yeah.
difficult to say, well, school was good as a response to that question. I mean, I guess you could give that answer, particularly if you're a teenager, right? But it's very hard to give that kind of answer. Or you could say, "Gosh, I remember last week you said something about a history test. How did you do on it?" And whatever their answer is, and say, "Gosh, did you want to do better? Do you think you can do better? Is there any way I could help you study?" Like those kinds of things. So you really want to, if nothing else, always offer through question form, if you're able to, the space for people to share where they
Right.
are about something. That's really
Oh,
what's
that's
important, is
great.
is the space.
So there's a lot of really good advice and specific examples in your book, You Don't
Hmm.
Say, which is available on Amazon and barnesandnoble.com. You can order through your local bookstores or libraries. I just wanted to mention that so that it's a very worthwhile and enlightening read to me. So this whole topic subject came close to home to me in that I never really thought about communication as a science or as something you could learn. That it was like, okay, this is you, this is how you communicate.
Right.
Yeah, if you have a difficult relationship with an individual, well then you adjust to that. But in many cases, I think people just say, okay, that's the way it's going to be. This is
Yes.
how I'm going to talk to my spouse.
Yes.
Relationships can begin to deteriorate because of poor communication. And I don't know that people in general know what to do about it. So I recommend your book for starters. But the example that happened to me is I had somebody very close to me who had a who's frankly was alcoholic,
Yeah. Yeah.
and
Difficult. Difficult.
I did not know how to help or what to
That's
say.
that's right.
So there was a program near me that specialized in helping families of alcoholics,
That's right.
and I went to the program. So the first, the first um, revelation was I'm signing up for this program. And they said, okay, what insurance do you have?
That is
And I said, no, wait a minute. I'm not coming here for me.
right.
I'm coming here because
That's
this
right.
other person.
That's right.
And then it dawned on me, well, hey, maybe this is my problem as well. And then it turned out that they were very helpful. They gave me
Hmm.
some really good tools. They also had group sessions
Yep.
where
Yes, they do.
people shared their experiences.
That's right.
Um, and it and then I realized, yeah, there is something to be had for this. Um, and I'll tell you how that translated into a difference, because
Mm.
I used to be in a business where I was in a retail business for many years, and we had a number of salesmen and managers
Yep.
in that business. And the first time I encountered an important manager with an alcohol problem, and
Yes.
this is before I had my training,
I understand.
I didn't know what to do.
Yep.
I demoted him. I transferred him, and I finally fired him. And I really handled it poorly, and I
Hmm.
feel bad about that. Um, After I went through this training because of the issue with the person close to me,
Yes.
um, our number one salesman had a drug addiction problem. And because I now knew what to say,
That's right.
I was able to get him into a treatment program. And after 30 days, he came back. He was much better. He stayed off the drugs. And he was so appreciative. I mean, I felt like in the second case, I was able to save him because I
Right.
knew how to communicate
Better.
better in this
That's right.
difficult situation.
That's right.
Um, yeah, so it's so valuable, really valuable. So tell me about the process of writing the book. What was that like for you?
I it was new. It was new. It was a new experience. And what's interesting about it being a new experience is because in part of my life, I write for a living. I am academically published many times over. I have written academic book chapters. I write. But that's a different life and a different type of writing and a different audience and a different message. This this book and future books are not just from the space of me being a communication scientist, but also from the space of personal experience, but also understanding that my purpose is to help people have better relationships and how to get there. And so this book and the process of writing it, I will say that you, Charlie, in particular, but the Munn Avenue Press staff believed in me. Right? Like I knew I had this message, I knew I had this idea, and my writing coach, which stuck with me every single month and gave me deadlines, you all believe that, hey, this is actually good. And what's interesting is I knew it was good, but when I heard it from you, I was like, it may actually be good. Right. So your belief in me, but also just in the message of the book and understanding it, and at the very least appreciating that, hey, this actually is pretty good, um helped move me through it. It was a process that I personally experienced a lot of communication challenges. So,
Right, right. Yeah.
so
Ironically,
I'm writing about this, and I mean, I'm in the middle of, estranged relationships, it was hard. It was difficult personally, to birth it. So what I've written, I say this, in any sort of speaking engagement, is that I'm not sharing with you what I've heard. I am sharing with you what I've lived.
you were
And
living it
so
while you were
I'm
writing it.
telling you, I am telling you, I'm telling you. And so it really was a healing process, but it also helped me realize when I had friends and other people read it that they would say, this is really good. Or they would say, man, that point you said, I was on a phone with a friend earlier this week, and we were talking, and she said, I had a good friend that wrote a book. And in her advice, she said, and she like quoted like from my book. We were talking, so she was like giving advice back to me. And so those kind of things kind of have meaning, but it also lets me know that I'm doing the right thing, because it's not about me. It is about, is someone else being helped? Is someone else able to understand that communication isn't something that just happens because you want it to? It's not something also that you just have to accept. It is something that you own and something that you are responsible for. So you have
Yeah,
to be a
yeah.
steward of it. Yeah.
And there's a couple of things that you just touched on that are interesting about the writing process and the effect of a book. Number one is books can change lives.
Mm,
If you read a book like your book, and either you change your behavior or learn something that gets you to do something different with your communication style such that it improves, or if you say, I'm just really interested in this now, I want to learn more and do better, well, then you're having an impact. That's
sure.
the other side. the other thing you said, which is it's not just about the reader, but it's also about the writer. Because you mentioned healing. And even though I write fiction, I've written 6 books of fiction, I find writing to be very cathartic. And I'll finish writing a chapter, have invented a new character in some difficult situation, and then
Yeah.
I'll reflect afterwards and say, well, where did that come from? You know,
Yes. Yes.
because in a way, and there are villains in my book, and the villains are nasty, and so I've had to self-reflect on, well, how did I come up with this really terrible character? And then I realize I can tie it back to something specific in my past or
That's
something
right.
traumatic that happened to me.
Yes.
um yeah. So it's fascinating, the whole dynamic, both for the author and for the reader. Because I think you can tell as a reader when the voice of the writer is authentic. The fact
Mhm.
that you were going through these experiences yourself, not just as an analyst, but as a human being,
That's right.
you can tell that when people write that way. It's true in fiction too. If it's an authentic voice, like I'm writing this book because I have a passion about it and I have something to say, versus, well, if I write in this genre, I might sell more books. So I'm going to make up
Oh,
something
yeah.
that appeals to people in that
Right.
demographic.
Hmm.
That's that's different. That's
Yeah.
not a human connection. And I
Right.
also we've talked in prior episodes about AI and
Hmm.
writing. I think that's where AI falls short too, is that authentic voice, that human voice. You can tell. We all have that radar. And that's true in conversation, right? I mean, if somebody is uh, putting up a screen between you and them, you know it. And some of your good questions can help penetrate that. But you know when somebody's being honest and forthright with you and when they're not, right?
That's
Would you
right.
say?
That's right.
Yeah.
And it's okay to acknowledge that. If you feel like someone is not being honest with you, it's absolutely okay to say that.
How
But
would you
oftentimes
say
we
it?
don't.
How would you
Right.
say it? I'm
You
curious as to how would
just
you
like
say
that.
it?
Listen, look, Charlie, I always offer different language and words for people to use, but I always say adopt it to how you speak, right? Because the way I say it is maybe potentially different. But if you feel like someone just isn't honest with you, you can say that. You can say, I asked you about this, and we're now talking about it, and you've told me this thing. But something just doesn't feel right because, and you have to give why. So oftentimes we will say something and we do not give a bit of rationale for how we got there. So then the person feels like they now have to defend themselves because they're being falsely accused. So all of these dynamics usually play out in communication, but no one ever says that, right? We just react based on that. So if someone feels like, gosh, you're really not being honest with me, it's okay to say it, but here's the thing. You have to care enough to even want to say it. Sometimes you could just not care enough, meaning this relationship doesn't matter. This person isn't that important to me. I know they're lying. I really don't care that they're lying. So I'm going to just conclude the conversation and move on with my life because I don't care
Right.
enough. When you do care enough, you say, gosh, I just feel like you're not really being honest with me, but here's why. Or I feel like, is that the whole story? Is that
Right.
really the whole story? And so you have to be able to do a couple of things when you say, gosh, what does that sound like? You have to share what you're feeling and why you're feeling it, but you also have to give that person the space to now respond and react in a way that does not put them in a position of defense. Even if they get defensive, you can say, that response may makes me think you took offense to what I said. Why did you feel offended? Well, first of
Yeah.
all, you could say, did you feel offended? So you have to validate if what you thought was happening happened, right? Because again, that becomes the, oh, I think this person feels offended, so they're responding like this, so now I'm gonna respond in a right. So and then communication breaks down because everyone's operating off what they think the other person thought or said or how they interpreted it. And so what you have to say is, gosh, that response made me think like you were offended. Were you offended? Yes
Oh,
or no?
that's
How did you
great
feel? How did you
advice.
feel about it? Oh, okay.
Yeah.
So now you're getting to the root of, well, what happened with them? And you're giving them the space to say what happened. And see, now you're in a space of saying, oh, okay, well, let's deal with the emotion that just happened. Because oftentimes the emotion happens and we step over it.
Right, right,
And we keep
right.
going in the conversation as if the emotion isn't happening, yet we're equally reacting to the emotion to the other person, and we've never said anything about it.
Yeah, yeah. That's and the here's why is very powerful because I think it removes the defenses a bit. Like because when you say, maybe you were offended, it seems like you were offended, people might react and say, oh, that's I'm being attacked. But then when you give them the here's why, and what you're doing is you're like opening the doors and the curtains to deeper communication. And you made a point earlier. The way you're phrasing that might not be exactly the way to phrase it because you adjust for the person and the
That's right.
situation. I
Oh,
mean,
that's true.
with some people that are, you might have the kind of communication where you can say, you know, guy, what's up? I can tell from your face
That's
that,
right.
that you're ticked off by what you just, what I just said. And I really only meant to say it
That's right.
because I care about you, and I was worried that X, Y, and Z was going on.
That's right.
Which could be your own language, and then other people who are highly sensitive, you might have to be a little more careful with that wording. Yeah.
That's right.
Yeah, no, great. Is there a paragraph or two from your book that you might want to read to us or share with us?
Yeah. So one of I was thinking through what would be um, really nice to kind of share with folks, and I picked something that's rather at the end of the book, and I'll tell you why. I've heard and I have coached people a lot through this notion of closure. And people get stuck there. And there are a lot of reasons why, and we definitely don't have time to get into that now. Um, but I think when we talk about closure, what we have to understand is that I think it would be helpful for a lot of folks to realize what closure really means for them and how they can best achieve it for themselves. And that closure, however someone defines it, does not sit with the responsibility of another person.
Okay, so let's hear
And
it.
so there, yep. So there's just one paragraph really quickly
Okay.
that I'll share with the audience. What we really want from closure is for something to be said that will remove our pain associated with the incident. We want someone to say something to make what happened make sense. We want to hear a reason for why they did something. We want to hear them return to the scene of the crime, if you will. That is an impossible and unfair task to ask of anyone. Sure, they may give reasons and try to make you understand their perspective, but could they ever say anything to undo the feelings and emotions you experienced when it happened? Of course not. Could they say anything that would rationalize what they did? No. You fundamentally cannot fathom why they would do it in the first place. How could they hurt you the way they did? So many questions go along with an issue that is left unresolved. That's why you have to make peace with moving on without getting closure from another person. Closure is a personal decision. It is not about the other person. It is about you being able to move on from a situation in peace. In short, closure is your responsibility, not someone else's.
Wow. That's truly profound. Oh, and you're right. It's ripe for a lot more discussion. So if you want to read more, please go to Amazon.com or BarnesandNoble.com and pick up a copy of You Don't Say. So what's next for you, Demetria? What are you working on now?
A couple things. So right here at the top of August, I will be at a book and paper fair. So I have been selected to be a author that's going to be able to connect with fans and sign books and sell books at the 40th annual Rocky Mountain Book and Paper Fair. So that's going to be August 17th through 18th at the Douglas County Fairgrounds. That's in Castle Rock, Colorado. So I'm looking forward to that event. I'm also in the process of connecting with new folks from an individual perspective, but also with organizations on communication coaching and what that looks like for folks that want help for themselves, meaning they have personal relationships or familiar relationships, and they just want to do better and they want to be better. But then also with organizations and saying, hey, I really want to create a culture of communication. So that's one of the things that I work with organizations on is how do you really establish a culture of communication for folks, because it helps everyone, right? Of course, it helps the bottom line, but I don't do what I do, to create mass amounts of profit. What you will realize though is that you will have financial benefit, but you'll also most importantly have people benefit when you're able to create a culture of communication for
Yeah.
folks.
And you're associated with the University of Colorado,
I am.
yes?
I am.
Medical school,
I am.
right?
I
Yeah.
am.
So doctors really need help with communication, don't they? Uh, we talk about things like bedside manner and
We
so forth.
do.
Do you help them with their communication skills there?
Yeah, so interesting that you bring that up because there's a whole sort of specialty, if you will, in communication science that's called doctor-patient communication. And that's all it focuses on is sort of that dyadic
Right.
interaction. And what's interesting when you think about the doctor-patient communication is historically, it has been a very paternalistic relationship. And it still, for the most part, is very much a paternalistic relationship where patients just rely on the doctor to say, this is what they need to do. But what I have found that's interesting is a couple of things happen in that dynamic, and that is patients will just agree usually, and then go and do what they want to do. Um, right. So a physician can absolutely recommend a particular medication or a particular self-management behavior. And, oftentimes they'll just nod and agree and then never get the prescription filled or get it filled, never take it or not right. And so it never happens. But oftentimes it's not communicated back that these things never happen, nor is it communicated in the moment why they either won't do it or are uncomfortable doing it or don't understand why they need to do it. So we usually never untangle that immediately. The other piece is how you define something and how I define something is different. So I always say there's these common words that we throw out as if everyone understands them equally, and that's just not true. So when you
Right.
say to me, gosh, you need to do more exercise, what does that mean? What does that mean, right? What does that mean? Because what you consider do more exercise and what the person that you're suggesting this to perceives to be do more exercise could be two very different things. And what do you consider to be exercise? And so we just say these words without
and what you need is a common language,
That's
right?
right. Well,
That's
you have to define what you say. I always tell
right.
people define when you're saying something, define what you mean. So if you say, gosh, I always suggest, for example, if you're a clinician, I always suggest patients try to do at least 30 minutes of moderate to vigorous exercise, which means your heart rate exceeds 130 beats per minute.
It's
Right. Like
specific.
you have to say those kinds of things so that the person understands or either agrees or disagrees and say, oh gosh, well, I think gardening is exercise. Okay, well, tell me exactly what you're doing with gardening, because what you do in gardening and what I do in gardening could be very different, right? Different things.
Sure.
Your gardening can involve a backhoe and everything, right? Like my gardening could just be out here. I don't even step into my yard, so to speak, because I have a raised planter on my back porch, and that's my gardening. So you have to understand the context by what people are saying these
And
things,
being
how they define them.
specific and
Oh
being
yeah.
specific. Yeah, it's so interesting. This idea of common language, that there was a point in my multiple careers where I
Yeah.
used to teach these team building seminars.
Yeah.
So one of the little exercises I would do with the whole group, I usually had
Yes.
groups of about 20,
Yeah. That's
uh,
exercise. Yeah.
and I would say, okay, and I'd write on the whiteboard
Yep.
the words sometimes,
That's right.
always, often, and never.
Oh, I
And
love it.
then I would ask them, tell me what percentage of the time is often and
I
what
love it.
percentage of the time
That's
is
right.
sometimes.
I
And
love
I
it.
would get these ranges from 0 to 100%. So it would yeah, on each of them, even
That's right.
always and never, I would get 0 to
Right, right.
100%. So it was illuminating for the group to realize that they didn't have a common language, because we use the word often in speech or sometimes,
That's right.
but it means two different things to different people, and it can be diametrically opposed in their minds.
Oppose. That's right.
Whereas 30 minutes of vigorous exercise with your heartbeat over 130, okay, I understand what that means.
And you can respond, like you can actually say, well, gosh, I'm not comfortable doing that. My breath, I lose breath too quickly when I do that. Or you can even say, well, what kind of exercise would do that? For like, what kind of exercise can I do to get my heart rate up that fast? Right. So it again, it creates space for
Well,
question, inquiry, and sharing.
you're giving me as a patient some ideas about how to communicate with the doctor,
That's right.
not just the
Oh,
other
that's
way
absolutely right.
around.
Oh, that's absolutely right. That's
And
absolutely right.
then in your teaching with doctors, do you ever teach them how to deliver bad news?
We have not taught that directly, meaning as an entire course,
Like
but that is a
you're
thing.
gonna die, bro.
It's
I mean,
right.
how do you deal with that?
It becomes very difficult because so here's the thing that's very interesting about just healthcare providers in general. The way they communicate, and for all of us, it even when you teach it, until they're able to practice it such that it becomes their default, they still revert to what they know inherently to do or say. And so it goes back to the example that I shared. If you come from a family where certain things aren't discussed or, not talked about, it can be very difficult if you have to share with a family that their family member is dying and you need to get here today. I don't expect them to make it through the night. That can be difficult for many reasons. One, it could be difficult because you, as a person, didn't come from a family structure or friend group that talked about death in that way and openly.
Yeah.
Death could have been done secretly. By secretly, it's like, oh, someone died. You never really even knew they were sick. They just, right, like they just died and they were like, oh, well, so and so passed. what happened? I didn't know they were sick, right? Like no one says anything, they hide it,
Right.
that kind of stuff, right? So if you come from that, that could be difficult. But here's the other thing: you could understand that you are not as emotionally intelligent or engaged or even interested to now deal with what comes with sharing that with a family member, because their responses can be all over the place. They could cry and want to, in essence, be sort of held, if that makes sense. You may not
Sure.
feel comfortable emotionally attaching to somebody like that. You may say, gosh, I don't want to deal with now all of these questions from these family members of saying, well, why didn't someone tell me? Because then it could become an that of, well, why didn't somebody tell me sooner? This is the first I'm hearing of it. Is there anything you could do? It becomes a whole lot of things that sometimes people emotionally are not, they're either not ready or they're not confident that they can engage in a healthy way. And so oftentimes when you do that, you just back off, right? You say,
Right.
hey, I can't do this. Like, can you go in and tell this person that? Right? You don't want to do it. But I think, again, that speaks to the confidence. And even when you're afraid or you have fear, you can still do it, and you do it from a space of being genuine, as you mentioned, and that is saying, gosh, I this is really difficult for me to share with you, but your mother or your brother or your sister, their health has really declined, and it definitely seems, at least from the clinical perspective and from the tests that we've run, that they do not have that much longer to live.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And that's true and that's honest. And you can say, if you have any questions, I'm here and I'm available to answer them. But what's also helpful is to talk people through what the other side and what the process looks like. I think that's also in healthcare where things fall apart, is people just don't know what's happening. So things just sort of happen and they feel, whether that's true or not, they may feel left out. And by that, I mean, if you just say, well, we think their body's shutting down, their organs are shutting down, so they're just going to die, and then you sort of disappear, right? And you leave
Right.
now for the nurses to handle it. That is unfair for just everyone involved, right?
Right.
There has to be ownership and responsibility for the process. But again, totally understanding, timing and different roles and
Right.
responsibilities of what
Right.
people have to do in the movement of managing healthcare. I understand that too. But I think being able to say, so here's what usually happens when organs shut down. Here's sort of what usually happens. And being able to share with them, this is kind of what that looks like. This is what, right? And you can say, and they can still hear you. So
That's
if you
so
want to
much
sit by their
gentler.
side, yeah, well,
That's
but it's
really,
honest. It's
yeah, it's
honest.
honest
Yeah,
and it's compassionate at the same
absolutely.
time. Because
Absolutely.
as you're talking about this, I'm thinking about the time that I got that phone call
Yeah.
about a
Yes,
parent,
yes. It's
right?
tough. Yeah.
And but it was the doctor. She handled it well in the sense that she said something like, "Well, I asked her, well, how's she doing?"
Yeah.
And the doctor said, "You better get here right now." And I knew exactly what that meant.
But that sends everyone in chaos, right? You're just like, what do you get here right now? That could, again, get here right now. How did you interpret that? Right? Like, get here
Like
right now means, oh my gosh.
she's not going to make it, and
Exactly. Yep.
I'm not going to.
That's right.
Yeah,
That's
it was a
yes.
very traumatic ride to the
Yes.
hospital with that. Yep. Yep.
Exactly. That right.
Yep.
And
Yep.
yeah. And so when you just say that, right, it in some instances it can just be, again, understandably so, because communication as a standalone course and class is not taught. And so people are just trying to manage kind of the best way they can in the process, whether it's delivering good news as a clinician, whether it's having a difficult conversation with a spouse or with a child, whether it's having to make very difficult choices about ending a relationship or deciding that a relationship has to change. All of these things are very difficult to do, but I think what is very helpful and what we have to be aware of is not only can you do it, But it's your responsibility to do it. You owe it to yourself, right? To be able to have that kind of conversation. There shouldn't be a conversation that you're scared to have and allow yourself and or the other person to die,
That's a
and
great.
leave this earth without without having some things being said.
I think you just gave me closure. That was a great summary
Oh,
of
thank you.
why communication is so important. We all have these experiences in our
Absolutely.
relationships with parents, children, life, death.
Absolutely.
And the thing that you do that gives me hope is to say, we can do this better if we just take the time to learn a little bit about it. So that's why you should buy You Don't Say from Amazon.com or Barnes and Noble, or tell your local bookstore to order it. And it's just such a pleasure to have you and share your thoughts and your book and your experiences, Demetria. Thank you so much for being here.
It has been a pleasure to be a guest of yours, Charlie, and
Yeah.
also to represent Munn Avenue Press in a positive light, so that people understand what a great publishing company you have and that you are building.
Oh, well, thank you so much. Yeah, it's so interesting for me to take an idea and work with an author and bring it to a book you can hold in your hand. It's quite gratifying for me. So if you do have a book in mind or a book you've written and you're wondering how to get it published and how to become a bestseller, please contact me at MUNN Avenue Press.com. We also do audiobooks and create podcasts just like this. Uh, so we'd be happy to talk to you about that as well. And to listen to the Munn Avenue News, you can just say, if you have an iPhone, Siri, play the most recent episode of the Munn Avenue News podcast. And next to me, and she might answer, you can also say, Alexa, play the most recent episode of the Munn Avenue News podcast, and she'll do it. And she's starting to play it now, in fact. So thank you again, Demetria.
My pleasure.
Thanks.
All right.